Hello. Um, Welcome. This is Teresa giving a presentation on our Lake Grove Art Literacy Unit for January 2024. Happy New Year. We're going to go over today Berthe Morisot. That is how you pronounce her name. It looks like Bertha, but she's French. It's pronounced Berthe Morisot. She is the first woman to join the Impressionist movement. Impressionists we've studied before in art lit. They tried to capture a quick moment or impression of a scene, capturing light and movement in that moment. Renoir is an impressionist we did last year, and he actually knew Berthe Morisot. So we'll just go through this real quick. There's this painting project for those who are here to know how to run this in your classrooms. The painting at the end of the project for this is a painting project, so we want to leave as much time as possible. So try to run through these slides relatively quickly to leave yourselves at least 30, preferably 40 minutes or more. So I'll just go through these and you can always edit it down if you need to. So in this painting, a self-portrait with Julie, Morisot presents herself as a painter and a mother. She, in her life, had one child, and she struggled, as modern women do, with the demands of work versus family life. And her work kind of depicts a lot of that, actually. She frequently painted domestic scenes. And often you'll see they have one or two figures with one figure turned away from the viewer, which kind of gives people a sense of less formality, more candid interaction. And it let her portray things like restless children, family members interacting, and her family members were a frequent subject matter. And you notice the thing to point out in this one is the brush strokes. What do you see? That doesn't look very realistic. They're loose slashing strokes. They don't try to blend or hide. And they leave areas unpainted. The canvas in this case looks orange because it wasn't primed, it wasn't treated. So as it aged, it turns orange. That wasn't actually on purpose. But you can ask the kids, is this painting realistic? And the answer is it's really not. It's very impressionistic, which means the effect is sketchy and even unfinished. It's just enough to give you a sense of what you're looking at, but without filling in all the details. This is a painting of Morisot's sister, Edma. They spent several years painting together until Edma got married, and then she became Morisot's frequent model. So women and children were considered proper subjects for female artists. There's a lot of other impressionists you've seen. They do cafe scenes, they do landscapes, but her work was largely focused on domestic life, which was kind of what was allowed for women at the time. And her work was actually pretty popular in its time. Maybe this is why it was considered less controversial than some of her other impressionists, the fellow impressionists. And she got better prices and sold paintings and got better prices than her fellow painters. But her paintings also subtly revealed women to be isolated or limited in freedom, and you can kind of see that throughout. So with the older students, I didn't make two separate decks for this, presentations for this, but you could talk with the older students about that a little bit more. This painting captures a moment in her sister's day, and it's got lots of natural light, which is something you might want to encourage in the hands-on project. Morisot repeated colors, shapes, patterns to create a unified composition. So there's shapes you can point out. The fan and the umbrella are similar. The dots in her dress and the dots of the flowers in the field. Shadows in the book are all lavender kind of color. And then green is a dominant color, which really makes the white pop out. And you can see a lot of use of different directions for the brush strokes that provide different details and different texture, including this like carriage in the background looks almost like it's moving because it's just barely sketched in. So this is a different type of painting for her, similar in feeling, but different scene. Morisot painted this landscape in plein air, which means in the open air, while visiting her sister, again, in the coastal city of Lorient. Plein air became really popular with Impressionist style because it encouraged capturing the feeling of a space instead of being really realistic. It's just painting, with all your gear out on the side of the road or a park or whatever, and just trying to capture the feeling. This landscape is very impressionistic. You can see the visible brush strokes. You can see dappled light and kind of imprecise figures and lines. And there's some things here going on even where I was mentioning that the artist is trying to point out the isolation of the woman in view. So she's kind of separated physically by this barrier of the wall. And she's seated close to the viewer, but lacks some sharp detail. You can kind of see that where the last painting was all green, this one's really blue, dominated by the blue, and this yellow, and that keeps it really unified so not a million colors being used. This painting was actually the first one to be accepted into the Salon of 1870, and it was criticized as being unfinished. Even her kind of signature in the background or in the bottom of the painting is a little bit sketchy. So just keep that in mind, that it's okay when you're doing, especially the hands-on project, it's okay for it to be a little unfinished seeming, and that's part of the style. Again, here Morisot used her sister Edma as a figure in this scene, interior setting this time. Is there anything that anyone notices that have been in most paintings so far? One of the things is this long white dress, which is a frequent motif. The fun part about this is to notice that it's not exactly all white. If you look at all of the details, you can tap here and see this kind of close up. It's not all white. You see blue and green and yellow. The yellows are used for highlights. The blues and purples and grays are used for the shadows. So that's something to use when you do the hands-on painting as well. This also, of course, in terms of subject matter, is a woman in isolation. Again, she's, pleasantly sitting here peacefully, having a nice time, potentially in her home, her very nice home, but she's separated from the city as the balcony railing kind of walls her off from that, keeping limits on her world. And in 19th century France, a woman would not venture out into the city unchaperoned or unescorted by a man. And that is kind of what's hiding beneath the subject of this painting. Here's another one. The painting shows Morisot's sister Edma and her niece on the balcony of a family home looking at Paris, not alone, but still separate entirely from the rest of the town. The vast horizon far away. It's unlike the other ones where it's very close up in that last one. This is a very, very far distant vista, but they're very separate from that city, and the child faces the city while Edma looks on protectively. This is original and typical of Morisot's work. She often painted the life of bourgeois family, meaning very well-off family members who you'd think would have every thing that they would need and want in life, but still have this feeling of isolation. And it's really the subject matter itself here is not all that interesting necessarily. It's the technique that was unprecedented and striking. The way that she's just using slashes of paint, and you can see the brush strokes. You can see that umbrella that the woman is holding is like barely just sketched in, but just enough that you know what it is. And there's a lot of detail here without there being a lot of detail. You can see the flowers, you can see the city, you get the feeling of the place, but it's not very detailed and realistic the way, say, a Botticelli painting would be. Here's a portrait of her sister again, gazing at her infant daughter, Blanche. And you can ask this question of the kids. There's a lot of white in this as well, but is it really all white? What other colors do you see? And we see blue in the shadows, yellows for highlights. There's some pink sketched in, just kind of to maybe on the edges of the sheer sheets there. And where you can ask where Morisot uses texture and where does she use more realism and details. The fabrics have really big, fat, rough brush strokes. And the pink details are kind of just blobbed on, but she's taken some time to put really feathery kind of detail into the hair and really detailed fine control on the eyes and the mouth to give her sister a recognizable face, whereas the child's face is a little bit more obscured. And that works with the fabric being hung over the crib. So the Impressionists frequently depicted life in the city streets, cafes, and theaters, but as I mentioned, Morisot was really limited as a woman to scenes of women doing things, and this woman is posed fashionably dressed right before she goes out to a ball. So what is she standing in front of is something you can ask the students. Most of them will probably say flowers. She's standing in front of a bunch of flowers, but the thing to note is there's not a lot of detail there. You just get the impression of them being flowers, and that's kind of interesting. So what makes them stand out also, what makes a subject stand out is the texture is not uniform. So the texture of the woman and her skin and her details are very smooth, and the texture of that background is very rough and textured. And that is something that you can carry forward into your painting as well, into the hands-on project. The lighter is more delicately controlled, and the background is much more chunky by contrast. And again, there's some whites in here. I guess you might say the dominant colors here are blacks and greens and whites. But there's some bluish tones in the flowers. If you look up close, there's some creamy white yellows in the dress, and some greens in the dress. This painting was bought by the French government and became one of the first Impressionist paintings to enter a French museum And Morisot viewed this as a huge achievement and her official liberation from amateur status into officially professionally a painter. Okay, just a few more here. This painting is of two women seemingly unaware they're being observed. And it kind of is, Morisot's goal often was to capture something that passes, as she put it. So just a moment in time. Does this look finished? And you can have a discussion quickly about why or why not. Reasons it might not look finished is that the background is quite blurry. It looks almost sketched in, like she's going to come back and fill it in later. The skirts are created with really big globs of paint just jabbed there, kind of, but not really defined at all. And if you tap, you can kind of see that. This is important to point out the different techniques here. So there's dabbing of paint, there's slashes of paint. She did a thing here with lots of globs of paint, which we'll talk about in a minute. Lots of different colors layered on top of each other. The overall color is green, but there's other colors mixed in, and it gives it all kind of depth and unity. But you notice she's not throwing in like a random blue here. It's really limited in palette still to purples and greens and a little bit of the red to kind of draw the eye to the middle of the page. So if you look at the closer details, you just see all the different separate brush strokes. And the effect is something that happens in Morisot's work, which is the subjects really blend into their background, but still stand out. You can kind of see the different directions the brushstrokes takes is what helps with that. So the painting method that we'll just take a minute to talk about here is impasto. This idea is that paint is laid into a surface really thick, enough that brushstrokes are visible. If you think about Botticelli or some of the other ones we've thought about in the past, they're very smooth, they're very realistic. Even if they have that like bold line around the outside. In this case, she's no blending. There's no trying to get it to be an even gradient. It's really about big, thick, fat brush strokes that are invisible all on their own. The paint can even be mixed right on the canvas. And that's something we can do in our hands-on project. And it's really fun. And when it's dry, impasto provides texture. So you can see the texture is visible there. But if you were looking at these in person, the paint actually comes off of the canvas. It's piled up really high, and it gives it a really different kind of look. Typically, they used oil paints. We'll be using acrylics that have been thickened. So here's another one in the daily ritual of combing hair and bathing and dressing, which is something women did a lot of in the 1800s. It became a very popular impressionist subject. And so in this case, you can see she's not facing the viewer, and but she is blending in with her surroundings, just like the last painting we looked at. So very subtly, you can kind of almost tell her apart from the background because of the direction of the brush strokes and a little bit of color added. But once again, there's like this different blues and greens in the painting, in the whites, and there's a lot of bold brush strokes that you can see that are visible. So it's like kind of chunky, but it gives the overall effect of white without being completely white. So something else you can optionally ask if you feel like you have time, because this is kind of the focus painting of the entire presentation, is how this makes you feel. Does it seem like the model is aware she's being watched? If you were the model, what would you be thinking of? And does that come through in the way that Morisot's painted this painting? Okay, just a few more here. The only man that Morisot ever painted was her husband, Eugene Manet, who's actually artist Edouard Manet's brother. They were in-laws. And here he's depicted in the garden with his daughter, Julie. Julie, again, is turned with her back away, but he's facing the viewer. It's very much a green-dominated scene. Really look at the brushstrokes in this one. It's almost like just brushstrokes. And if you take a step back and blur your eyes, that's when you see the figures. So because of the direction that the brushstrokes are painted, they're almost surrounded by a circle. It's interesting to see. So you can use that as an effect as well when you think about painting impasto style. And in her later years, Morisot came under the influence of Renoir, who we studied last year in Art Lit. He worked from preparatory sketches, so he also did paintings, but he would often do or oil paintings, but he would often do a watercolor first to kind of plan out what he was going to paint. And that's something Morisot's done here. What's interesting and striking here is that she's able to get the exact same effect without the impasto effect, without that like big, thick, layered on paint. She's doing it just because of the way that the brush strokes are done independently, uniquely, with lots of different colors and layers. It's all, it's not blobby, but it still achieves that look. And this one, a few more of her daughter here. at their vacation cottage, just kind of looking at the brushstrokes again. You can linger on this a little more, but again, the overall effect is white, but it's got that, like, there's a lot of blues in it as well. And another one where it's a lot of greens, but again, the daughter wearing white. And actually, this is not her daughter. This is someone else, but she's wearing white and she has this green background with lots of different brushstrokes. You can kind of see how the white has been layered on top of the green in that detail in order to make it look like the sun is shining on it. And some more pictures of a different kind of brushstroke, more smooth, more fluid. This one actually is the last one in our presentation. It actually is unfinished. This one, you can kind of see she didn't get around to some of the edges. I don't know how we know it's unfinished. I suppose she said so. But it's a self-portrait with Julie, which is the first paint. It's similar to the self-portrait with Julie, which is the first one we looked at today. This is of her daughter. It has large areas of the canvas that are left undone. And that's something just to note as we do our project. It's okay to leave some areas empty if you feel like that's what serves the painting. So you can ask here kind of where the texture of the brushstrokes is most visible. It's really around these edges. I mean, they're all over the place really, but different kinds of brushstrokes in the dog, in the couch, and then some of the sketchy areas around the chair. Cool, so that is the end of this presentation for Morisot. We are going to, I will post a separate video about the painting because I don't have the supplies prepared. So tune in for that. Thank you very much.